When using a camera set to manual for the first time, the most common questions are what is shutter speed and what is aperture. Superficially, you could say that they both control the amount of light coming into the camera, but there is far more to it than that. Let's first look at shutter speed. For those of you who don't know, the shutter is a device that opens and closes to let light fall on the sensor. The sensor is the part of the camera that actually sees the picture. If you look on your camera, you'll see a wide variety of speeds, from lower than 60 seconds to over 1/8,000th of a second, depending on the camera model. There is also the B or bulb setting, but we'll get to that later. Let's take the idea of controlling how much light enters the camera first. If the shutter is set to a standard setting of 1/200th of a second, then the shutter will open for a duration of 1/200th of a second and then close. If this was a very sunny day, even in that short duration a lot of light would hit the sensor, so you may need to then shorten the duration. Equally, if it is dark, this may not be enough to let sufficient light fall on the sensor, so a longer duration is the way to go. So the simplest summary of the first function of a shutter, which is the amount of light coming in the camera, the rule is the slower the shutter speed, the more light that falls on the sensor. So again, make it really simple. If it was dark, you'd be looking at a slower shutter speed, and if it was light, you'd be looking at a faster shutter speed. So now let's look at the other function of the shutter, which is how motion is shown in a photo. So here we have a very basic model of someone walking down a path. So let's put markers on a 1 second duration of her walking. If the shutter was open for 1 second, then however far she walked during that 1 second interval would be blurred. So now let's set this to a 60th of a second. You can see now that the range of her walking is much less, so the blur would be correspondingly less. So now imagine that you're a sports photographer and you're photographing Usain Bolt sprinting. You think of how far he travels even in a 1/60th of a second. So to get a sharp image of him, you could be in the 1,000th of seconds for the duration of the shutter. So a very quick summary, if you're filming things that are moving or moving fast, then a shorter duration for the shutter, in other words a faster shutter speed, is definitely the way to go. So then the question is, why would you just not keep the shutter on a fast speed then, given that that seems to result in a sharp image? Well, one reason is sometimes you need more light, and a short shutter duration will not let much light fall on the sensor. But there's another reason, creatively. Long shutter speeds can be very effective when used properly. Take this example of a waterfall. With a very fast shutter, the water is almost crystal-like and absolutely sharp, which is great. But if you place the camera on a tripod so that it's immovable, and then take the shutter duration up to over a second, all of a sudden the water blurs and sort of blends together and looks very magical. Equally at night, set the shutter speed to a long duration, and not only does it brighten up the image, but things like car headlights will trace across the picture and look very cinematic. You can also use this technique in video if you have the facility to have a long shutter speed on your video camera. Long shutter durations are great at night instead of a flash. But the main thing to remember with this is you probably need to be filming things that are stationary, because any movement across the duration will result in blur. But again, you have creative license with this, so just best way to learn is to experiment. Even in sports photography, it's good to sometimes use a slower shutter. Imagine if somebody's running. If you pan the camera with them, so they're always in the center or they're always in the same place in the frame as you pan the camera, when you take the picture with a slower shutter speed, they will be relatively sharp, but the background will be blurred. And this is a really good way to give an impression of speed or energy. One final reason for being aware of the effects of different shutter speeds is handshake. 1/60th of a second is typically as low as you can go if you're hand holding a camera. This is because your natural movement will create a blurred photo over the longer shutter duration. So the trick here is if you have to use a slower shutter speed or a longer shutter duration, use a tripod or rest the camera on a wall or brace yourself against something. It will make an amazing difference. Finally, the B setting. What is that? Well, the B setting allows you to lock open the shutter for as long as you want. So in theory, you could be in a pitch dark area and you could lock the shutter open for an hour, and it would gradually get enough light on the sensor that you'd be able to have a usable image, which can be a very nice effect. You've probably seen photos with the B setting without actually realizing it. A lot of photographers will use this setting if they're filming a night sky with stars. And then, of course, you get those amazing circular traces of the stars in the sky, which are very popular and look amazing. You can imagine, though, if you tried to hold the shutter open manually for an hour, either your finger would drop off or you would transmit so much shake to the camera the picture at the end would be unusable. So it stands to reason you need a remote shutter release that you can lock off to be able to actually make any kind of intelligent use of this function. So now think of this scenario. You want to use a slow shutter for creative reasons, but the trouble is the ambient light is very high, so the camera is telling you to use a faster shutter speed. So what do you do then? Well, this neatly leads us onto